괜히 좋은데.
그렇게 할게요.
역시 모르네.
Hi, it's me, and welcome to this overview and guide on how to use the Kurokumo Clan identities from Limbus Company. The Limbus Company Kurokumo Clan IDs have several things in common, the most noticeable one being that they all have effects relating to the Bleed status effect. Bleed causes enemies to take damage whenever they flip coins. In addition to this, they tend to mix in other status effects to make clashing better, most notably Paralysis, which forces an enemy to flip tails an amount of times equal to their paralysis. There are 3 IDs from Kurokumo Clan in the game right now: Kurokumo Clan Wakashu Ryoshu, Kurokumo Clan Wakashu Honglu, and Kurokumo Clan Wakashu Rodion. Order from worst to best, I'd say that Rodion is the weakest, then Ryoshu, then Honglu, but you could make the argument that Ryoshu may be the best of the 3. Unlike the Shi Association, I actually believe all of these IDs are at least serviceable, if not very strong. Each of these IDs only has a single type of physical damage that they can deal. Honglu and Rodion only deal slash damage, where Ryoshu only deals pierce damage. As a result, they fit best into teams that need more of that particular damage type, especially with how many good IDs seem focused on blunt damage specifically. They're supplemental rather than building around them, though you can build around them. Now let's talk about them individually, starting with the first 3-star ID I received when I started playing, Kurokumo Wakashu Rodion. Rodion actually has a unique setup compared to the other 2, and that's because it incorporates another status effect into its strategy. It's poise. Yeah, so Rodion relies pretty heavily on crits to perform well in combat. She's also technically a tank ID, which is reflected in her defense skill that gives her 1 protection on use as a counter, which doesn't give her protection until after being hit. Okay. Her first skill can be seen as a tool to maintain poise, and rolls pretty well for a skill 1. 5 to 11 is the roll range you want for a 1-coin skill 1 in most cases, and the fact that it's Gloom allows her to build one of the most valuable Sin resources in the game. Scattering Slash is her defining skill and the one you're going to be using the most. 6 to 12 with 2 coins is not fantastic, but it's her only source of poise count, and actually gives a large amount of poise and inflicts a good amount of bleed compared to other bleed skills in the game. Her third skill rolls very high and inflicts more bleed than any other single skill in the game, if it lands a crit. Well, at least the crit chance is doubled if the target already has a lot of bleed, so it happens more often than you think. This actually isn't where skill 3 ends. To see that, we have to look at her combat passive. It's one of the more interesting passives in the game, which of course means it's one of the least useful passives in the game. With 4 Lust Resource and 5 or higher poise, her counter becomes her skill 3, which technically enhances it but makes it so that the protection doesn't activate. It has a little too many prerequisites to use often, but there are ways around this. If you have 4 or more Pride and Blade Lineage Yi Sang is on your bench, all of the skills that give her poise will also give +1 poise count, which allows any poise identity to maintain their crit chance, which is arguably the most important for this ID, because it lets you inflict massive amounts of bleed with her third skill. This is also the only Kurokumo ID that perfectly fuels the character's base ego skill. What is cast deals very heavy slash damage to healthy enemies, and even inflicts bleed at the cost of 1 Gloom and 3 Pride. However, you should only ever use this skill if you need to win a clash, since the passive causes your SP to drop when another character is killed. And since most of Rodion's skills only have 1 coin, your sanity is a lot more important for winning clashes. It isn't worth it for the 10% slash damage in this case. Her support passive is also pretty useless. 10% slash damage for the slowest ally is insignificant, especially since base Rodion gives a 20% boost to all heads coins, the only requirement difference being between needing Gloom or Wrath. Next up, we have Kurokumo Ryoshu, which is the best ID in the game for directly inflicting bleed count. Her first skill does not do this, but rather inflicts 3 paralysis, which is great for fighting slow enemies that still need to clash with your allies, and has the 5-11 roll range that is so nice for skill 1s. It's also gluttony, meaning you can bring her in Leisure Domain spam teams. Her skill 2 is a 2-coin skill that rolls 5 to 15, and inflicts a small amount of bleed and bleed count. It's also notably one of the only skills in the game that inflicts damage down, which is a nice defensive addition for a very good offensive skill. Lastly, we have Lenticular Swirl, which is one of the strongest skills in the game in both rolls and effects. 8 to 16 is a very high range for clashing, especially on a multi-coin skill, and the second coin inflicts 3 of both a bleed count and offense level down. Bleed count is the name of the game if you're building around the status effect, and offense level down makes winning clashes against the affected enemy much easier, provided that somebody is yet to clash with that enemy in the current turn. Her passive increases damage dealt to enemies with bleed by 10% with 3 Lust Resonance, which doesn't really matter in the long run, but Lust is the most valuable Sin affinity that the Kurokumo IDs have, so you're likely to have other passives in your team, so it should activate often. Her support passive just lets the fastest ally inflict an extra bleed with hits, but you'll want to have this ID with you if you're running bleed anyway, just for the bleed count from her second and third skills. Speaking of that support passive, Kurokumo Honglu has the exact same one. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the only case of exact overlap in the game's support passives. You're not likely to leave either of these IDs behind in bleed teams, so again, it isn't likely to come into play. If Rodion is Kurokumo's tank and Ryoshu is Kurokumo's support, then that makes Honglu their resident damage dealer. His first skill does not display this well. 0.65 growth is not what you'd typically see on a heavy damage identity, and this skill often loses clashes even at high sanity, but it is his Lust skill, which is important exclusively for that reason. The real defining skill of this ID is his skill 2, Cloud Cutter. It can recycle both coins when attacking, similarly to She Ishmael's second skill, except in this case it does not use those coins during a clash. The damage potential of this is shockingly high and has kept Kurokumo Honglu among the strongest identities in the game since launch. It's oddly anti-synergistic with Bleed though, not being able to activate if the enemy has 4 or more bleed count, which just makes him better as an easy include for non-bleed teams. His final skill, Cloud Burst, inflicts quite a lot of bleed and paralysis, but ultimately is also not great at clashing. That's this ID's weakest point. It doesn't do great in clashes and can often suffer the first 2 or 3 turns in a fight where you can't select your targets manually. Cloud Burst is also not going to come anywhere close to Cloud Cutter in terms of damage dealt, which makes it mostly valuable due to its generation of sloth resources. His passive is similarly negligible like Ryoshu's, but instead of doing a little extra damage, it increases the amount of bleed inflicted during the turn by 3. Once again, you'll usually run this in Lust teams anyways, so it will activate, giving a relatively small boost. All of the Kurokumo Clan IDs generate Lust and Pride resources with their skills, and Lust tends to be the one of the strongest resources due to it activating the strongest support effects and being relatively common. When it comes to enabling you to use Ego, there are only 5 Ego in the game that rely on both of these Sin resources to use. However, there are a lot of useful Ego that need at least one of these resource types to be activated. For example, Honglu's base Ego requires 1 Lust and is a decently powerful AoE Ego that heals his own SP, and provides SP healing for struggling allies who need it the most. Honglu's Roseate Desire is not the greatest attack by itself, but its passive inflicts Lust Fragility to enemies for the next turn, and greatly aids Lust teams to have even more as a result. And Honglu's Dimension Shredder, I'm sure I am talking about Honglu a lot, huh? Is a great tool to increase your overall damage output at the cost of 3 Pride, inflicting both Fragile and Rupture, boosting all damage types. It also gives Honglu better survivability due to its revival effect if you ever need it, but you'll probably be using the charge to fuel its corroded attack instead for extra damage potential. You may also take notes that all of the above Ego are on either Don Quixote or Otis, and Don's base Ego is particularly spammable and also inflicts bleed for bleed teams. If you're planning on using more than one member of Kurokumo Clan, both Don Quixote and Otis are very good team members for them. For the team I decided to build for this showcase, I ended up taking all 3 Kurokumo IDs alongside 7 Association Otis and W Corp agent Don Quixote, with my main strategy being focused around using Otis's superior speed to repeatedly throw out Yasunyata Tadrapam in order to give an attack boost to my allies. The added Lust Fragility is also very nice when leaning more heavily into Lust builds than this, but you could also use Sun Shower in the same party if you'd rather up Otis's damage potential specifically instead. Both are solid options in this case. You also occasionally get to throw out Ebony Stem, which not only inflicts a small amount of bleed, but also allows Otis to inflict large amounts of Rupture and Bind, further increasing your damage overall. While Don Quixote can't use Telepole in this team, her W Corp ID is still one of the better standalone IDs in the game, and is helpful for building Sloth and Gloom resources that Honglu and Otis are going to need regardless. On top of that, she also naturally inflicts both Rupture and Fragile with her regular skills, and her base ego allows her to still be able to trigger Lust Resonance effects for the team. One of the most important support passives in this party comes from N-Corp Faust, and I really don't like having to suggest this ID in every guide, but its value as a support is just too high not to mention. Being able to slot her in so easily to any Lust team, both as a support or an active, makes her extremely versatile, and her ability to inflict nails is exceptionally useful. Speaking of nails, if you wanted to lean heavier into bleed rather than focusing on using support ego, the best identities for a team like that would be Sous Chef Gregor for his healing and support, or his ability to inflict bleed count, or any of the N-Corp IDs that inflict a lot of nails, since nails directly increases the amount of bleed and bleed count on enemies at the end of the turn. And that's about all I have to say about Limbus Company's Kurokumo Clan identities for the time being. I hope you found this little overview helpful and encourage you to play around with these identities, and I'm curious to see what other strategies you all can come up with involving these IDs, so feel free to comment down below if there's a synergy that you've found or a strategy involving them that works well for you. Also consider liking the video and subscribing as it helps me out a lot. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you back for the next video. Bye bye!